So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Starmer's speech. One of his first major speeches, really, as prime minister, and oh boy, is it bad.
I will be honest with you. There is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice given the situation that we're in.
It's cap. They always have a choice. They are choosing to do these budget cuts. They are choosing to take away payments from elderly people. These are all choices. Politics is about choices at the end of the day.
Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heavier burden.
So he's going to increase things like, the income tax rate for the top earners. The answer is no, not from what I've heard.
And that's why we're cracking down on non-doms. Those who made the mess should have to do their bit to clean it up.
I mean, I get that, Sunak's wife had non-dom status, but, I'm not putting, it sounds like he's putting the whole blame on her. It's a joke, by the way.
And that's why we're strengthening the powers of the water regulator and backing tough fines on the water companies that have let sewage flood our rivers, lakes and seas.
That's good, but it's not really budget related, is it?
But just as when I responded to the riots, I'll have to turn to the country and make big asks of you as well, to accept short-term pain for long-term good, the difficult trade-off for the genuine solution.
It's a sucker's trade, because the thing is, with austerity, you're not going to get growth. We've seen that over the last 10 years. All austerity does is shrink the state and plunge more people into poverty. That's all it does. It destroys public services. It destroys, society as a whole. That's what austerity does.
And I know that after all that you have been through, that is a really big ask and really difficult to hear. That is not the position we should be in. It's not the position I want to be in.
And yet it's the thing you're inflicting on the country, despite the fact that when Clement Attlee inherited the country, he did not make these decisions. He went for huge amounts of borrowing and invested that money into the country, and his legacy still lives to this day. That could be you. That could have been you, Sakir. But your legacy will be as, a massive fraud who plunged this country back into austerity. Well, we're still in austerity, really. You're just another George Osborne, pal. He does talk about kind of the stuff that he's achieved so far in the space of a few weeks.
I said before the election, and I say it again really clearly today, growth, and frankly by that I do mean wealth creation, is the number one priority of this Labour government.
But again, you're not going to get that through austerity. Genuinely just baffles me how economically illiterate these kind of points are.
And that's why in our first few weeks we've set up the National Wealth Fund, because we want every person and every community to benefit. It's why we've unlocked planning decisions, because we're going to build 1.5 million new homes.
I mean, with the planning permission stuff, that's fine, as long as you can get the workers in to do it, and the houses are built properly, and you kind of make sure that, I think they really need to improve housing building standards, because the state of new builds is abysmal at times.
It's why we set up Great British Energy, to create good jobs and cut people's bills.
I mean, you guys can't. Is it great? Is British Energy? Is it an investment vehicle, or is it an actual company that's going to own assets? Genuinely baffled. I don't get which one it is, because they're very unclear on this.
And it's why we ended the national strikes that have crippled our country for years. Because I defy anyone to tell me that you can grow the economy when people can't get to work because the transport system is broken, or can't return to work because they're stuck on an NHS waiting list.
See, this is fine. I think they're stuck to work, talking about, train strikes. I don't know if that impacts that many people, but the healthcare one, that does impact a lot of people. So that one, he deserves props for, kind of doing a deal with the junior doctors. That's fine.
We've done more in 7 weeks than the last government did in 7 years.
So it's a low bar, and if your bar is the Conservative Party, then we're really not going to get that far as a country. Really, the bar should be 97 or 95, 1945. Really, those are the bars that I would rather look to in terms of investment and people's living standards improving, rather than comparing it to one of the worst governments this country's ever seen. And when you look at the actual definition for austerity here, fiscal austerity can be achieved through increases in government revenues, primarily via direct and indirect taxes. So the indirect tax we are seeing here is the lack of movement on the tax bands, especially the lower tax bands. Despite the fact that people are getting pay increases, that's something I'll give Labour props for, increasing public sector pay and increasing national minimum wage. I'll give them props for that. But if they don't move the bottom tax band, it is a stealth tax in terms of you will receive more money, but you also pay more in taxes. And or a reduction in government spending, which we have seen that being mentioned as well, that there'll be a 1% cut to Whitehall budgets and things like that. That is austerity. So for anyone to argue otherwise, they really actually have to look at the definition of austerity and understand it properly. It's increasing tax revenues to kind of cut the deficit or pay off the national debt, or it's budget cuts, which we are potentially going to see under the Labour government. And when you look at some of the analysis around it, from Beth Rigby saying that the main part of the speech was a warning to the public that things are potentially going to get worse. And I think people might remember how bad this is. Honestly, even in a couple of years' time, if things do get markedly bad, considering how bad things are currently. The BBC does discuss some of the options Labour have. A stealth tax, like we mentioned earlier. So Paul Johnson, director of the IFS, believes the most obvious solution would be to focus on tax thresholds, the amount of money you can make before tax is paid. Currently, the thresholds are going to be frozen until 2028, which is a while. And the policy amounts to a tax rise because of the so-called fiscal drag, which is something we mentioned before. Capital gains tax, putting that up, which is something Labour said they weren't going to do or didn't have plans to increase, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Reduced pension tax relief. I think this is one of the things they'll go after is pensioners, especially the more well-off pensioners. I think that's what Labour will do because they typically don't vote for Labour anyways. And raising inheritance tax, that's something we actually spoke about as well, which is one of the things mentioned. No mention of a wealth tax though, or increases on the rich. And when we look at the 22 billion, this magic figure that's appeared out of nowhere, if you listen to the Labour Party and kind of client journalists, the IFS saying the 22 billion black hole was obvious to anyone who dared to look. Even the SNP knew about it. You had other YouTube commentators talking about it. You had Owen Jones talking about it. So everyone knew, apart from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. It's wild, isn't it? A week on from Rachel Reeves' big reveal that there's a 22 billion black hole in the nation's finances. What are we to make of the claim and counterclaims? And more importantly, what can we learn? The person writes here, frankly, nobody comes out of this spelling of roses, not the Conservatives, who really did leave a lot for the new government to clear up, and were not honest about the challenges ahead, which is true. Not Labour, which knew the broad outline of these challenges but refused to confront them in its manifesto and pre-election statements, which this is also true. Labour refused to acknowledge this £22 billion black hole. So that's the situation we're in now. Reeves ran through a whole host of issues, but there were two big ones. The first was the lack of cash available to meet public sector pay settlements of any more than above 2%. The second was nearly all the estimated 6.4 billion of cost of supporting asylum seekers, which was unfunded. So you had a load of government projects and things that didn't have any cash allocated to them. So this 22 billion figure, I think the IFS said it was about 19 originally, but given that Labour have given public sector pay increase and things like that, I think that's why this figure is higher than what was originally reported. But that's, I think, more down to actions of the Labour government rather than anything else. Which again, public sector pay, I support increasing that. But what I don't support is the kind of budget cuts that we're hearing about. What I don't support is keeping the two-child cap. What I don't support are things like those kind of measures which have damaging impacts on society. And here you got Owen Jones talking about this. Was back in July.
For me, it's about the looming black hole in the nation's finances, which neither political party is being honest about. Labour are going to win a massive landslide. Spoiler, that's how this story ends, by the way. But as the Institute for Fiscal Studies put it, both main parties, and I quote, are avoiding the reality that they effectively signed up to sharp spending cuts while arguing over smaller changes to taxes and spending.
So this was before the election even happened. So somehow he knew, but they didn't. Somehow Stephen Flynn knew.
Cuts coming down the line, agreed to by
£18 billion worth of cuts. That's what I mean. The figure is higher, I think, partly down to some of the budget allocations, but also partly down to the fact that Labour have agreed public sector pay increases.
Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt.
£18 billion worth of public sector cuts. How is that going to help public sector services? It's not.
£18 billion worth of cuts, and that's going to put a lot of people's lights off. And you've got to be straight with the public.
He said there's going to be no austerity. Sorry, Anas, mate.
About the cuts that Labour are signing up to by accepting the fiscal constraints of the Tories.
The amount of funding that Labour are promising the Scottish NHS is less than what the Tories gave us at the last year's budget. That is the stark reality of Labour's funding plans, and why I actually agree with Labour on this point. All roads lead back to Westminster.
People are faced in this election austerity from the Tories, austerity from the Labour Party.
It's a travesty the SNP kind of collapsed a bit during this election. Also, the Unionist vote did kind of move towards Labour, but there was a slight SNP collapse, and it's tragic because generally they are good at calling out Labour from the left, which is what we need, really. You've got a Labour MP who's against the cuts to pensions, winter fuel cuts and things like that.
We know 4,950 people, according to the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, died because their homes were cold. Many more went to hospital. And of course, ill health plagues on the frail and elderly. So we need to make sure we're protecting people and wrapping some warmth around them this winter. Of course, we understand that some people, they may find it a little bit difficult, but they can afford their energy bills. But there are many which can't. We not only have inherited this economic black hole, which Rachel Reeves was absolutely right to plug the gap, cancelling projects and obviously explaining that, or else we would have seen interest rates soaring.
That's not true. When we saw massive amounts of borrowing during COVID, we didn't see interest rates go soaring. Now, this idea that massive amounts of borrowing causes interest rates to go up is again economic illiteracy. That's what it is. The reason we saw interest rates go up is because Liz Truss, absolutely decimated the economy. The markets completely lost faith in her. Also, the fact that we had massive amounts of inflation as well. Which wasn't really linked to the Liz Truss budget. It's one of the reasons why we saw interest rates go up, despite the fact that interest rates were in itself, the rises were causing some inflation as well. So this is just complete rewriting of history, really, and economics, I think, as a whole. But here you have a Labour MP actually pushing the Chancellor to think again about the cuts, and having a situation where people need to go to the hospital because of the fact that they are so cold they become sick. That has a cost. And the fact that the government won't really acknowledge that is problematic for me. The fact that other kind of pro-Labour pro-Labour commentators won't acknowledge the fact that that has a cost is frustrating to no end. Austerity is not good, guys. Means testing benefits is not good, generally. Here you have Lewis Goodall saying thoughts on Starmer's speech, self-evidently highly political, little in the way of policy, instead of framing of politics to come, but there's a paradox to it all. He goes, as predicted, Labour are trying to suggest things that are worse than they knew. There's a bit of truth that though broad contours of state of economic policy public realm were known, so that's something we discussed earlier regarding the figures. He goes, that itself is an indictment of a generation of policymakers and politics. Voters might be forgiven for thinking they've heard it all before. Indeed, they have since George Osborne in 2010. Ernie Bevin said he wanted to be at the Ministry of Labour till 1990, i.e. to set up the terms of thinking on industrial relations for half a century. It sometimes feels like George Osborne will be Chancellor till 2050, because what George Osborne managed to do is convince people that the economy is like a household budget. And the fact that you have Labour MPs who know better, who have said austerity doesn't work, and still push this rhetoric, just so stupid. And they are the architects of their own downfall, because they will not get the growth they need based on the fiscal rules that they've set out for themselves. That's one of the most frustrating things. So keep going, when it comes to this stuff, like we mentioned.
Over the last 6 years, we took difficult, sometimes painful decisions in order to rebuild our economy.
I think around 300,000 people died because of austerity, so yeah, difficult for them, painful for them, but not for you, George, mate.
Economy, strengthen our banks, put our public finances in better order.
Don't make the mistake we made in 2010 after the financial crash, which was to think that the way through this is to go for austerity. There is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful.
Man, oh man, oh man. It's just completely bizarro world. I'll be doing another video kind of on the kind of the defenders of this kind of austerity and of Labour. That'll be a second video on this. But yeah, you know, when you see, he knows austerity is bad. I think Rachel Reeves should know as well, and so the defenders of Labour who defend these kind of austerity policies should know this. If anyone denying that, you know, we're not going to see austerity below inflation, you know, rises, you know, when it comes to budgets and things, that's austerity. If we're not keeping in line with inflation, that's effectively a cut. You know, when the Conservatives were doing this stuff, you had these same commentators all over it talking about how this is a cut, that's a cut, etc. Talking about stealth taxes. Now that Labour are in, they don't talk about that. All they do is talk about above inflation public sector pay rises. That's it. That's all they mention. No, oh, it can't be austerity because these pay rises. They look at nothing else, just the pay rises. It's ludicrous to me. I genuinely don't get it. But, you know, they're going to take their victory lap over this stuff, over, you know, things that are completely stupid. But I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. A like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.